She didn't come to Blackthorn Ranch looking for a fight. She came looking for a reason to keep living. But Eleanor Hartwell had buried a husband and a daughter in the same year. And when a woman survives that kind of grief, something changes inside her. Something sharpens. She stops trusting polite smiles and starts trusting her instincts. And on a quiet Tuesday morning, when she leaned over 3 small boys and caught the smell rising from their medicine cups, sweet, metallic, wrong, every nerve in her body screamed the same word. Poison. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. Like, follow, and stay until the very end. The summer Eleanor Hartwell arrived in Harlan County, the heat came early and stayed mean. It pressed down on the flatlands like a hand over a mouth, relentless, suffocating, offering no apology. The dirt roads cracked, the creek beds ran thin, and the few trees that lined the county road to Blackthorn Ranch stood in the afternoon haze like exhausted sentinels, their leaves curled inward as if trying to protect something soft at their centers. Eleanor noticed the trees. She noticed everything these days. Grief had done that to her, stripped away the comfortable blindness most people walked around in, and left her raw and hyper-aware, like a nerve ending exposed to open air. Colors were sharper, smells were stronger, silences carried weight. She sat in the passenger seat of old Roy Perkins' flatbed truck, her single leather suitcase wedged between her feet, her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that had nothing peaceful about it. Roy had offered her a ride from the bus depot in town as a favor to his cousin, who ran the boarding house where Eleanor had spent 3 days trying to decide whether to accept the job offer that had found her through a chain of strangers' kindness. "Ranch is about 4 miles out," Roy said, his eyes on the road, his voice carrying that particular careful gentleness people reserved for the recently bereaved. "Mercer's a decent enough man, private, works hard. His boys are—" He paused, choosing words. "They've had a rough go of it." "I know," Eleanor said. "That's why he needs help." Roy glanced at her sideways. "You ever done caregiving work before?" "I raised a daughter." The words came out level, without trembling, though they cost her something. "And I nursed my husband through 18 months of illness before he passed. I know how to take care of people." Roy nodded and said nothing more. The road curved, and Blackthorn Ranch appeared. First the fence line, weathered gray posts and rusted wire stretching in both directions, then the long gravel drive lined with those cracked, suffering trees, and finally the house itself, a 2-story farmhouse built from dark timber, broad-shouldered and solid, the kind of structure that had been put up by someone who intended to stay. Eleanor thought it looked like a house that had forgotten how to be a home. Gideon Mercer met her on the porch steps. He was taller than she'd expected from the brief letter he'd sent. 6 feet and some change, with the weathered hands and permanent squint of a man who spent his days outdoors and his nights worrying. He might have been handsome once, in a straightforward, unadorned way. Now he wore his exhaustion openly, like a coat he'd stopped bothering to take off. There were shadows under his dark eyes that spoke of months of broken sleep, and his jaw carried the rigid set of a man using sheer stubbornness to hold himself together. He shook her hand. His grip was firm without being performative. "Mrs. Hartwell." "Mr. Mercer. You had a long trip." "I've had longer days," she said, and something in the directness of it seemed to register with him. He looked at her, really looked, for just a moment, and then nodded. "Come inside. I'll show you the house before you meet the boys. There are things you should know first." The interior of the house was clean but cheerless. Someone had been maintaining it with efficiency rather than warmth. Dishes washed, floors swept, curtains straight. But there were none of the small living details that made a house breathe. No flowers on the table, no drawings pinned to the kitchen wall, no boots kicked carelessly near the door. Gideon walked her through the downstairs in a few minutes, his narration clipped and practical. The kitchen, the larder, the laundry room, the back porch. Then he stopped at the bottom of the staircase and turned to face her with an expression that Eleanor recognized immediately. The expression of a father who was frightened and trying very hard not to let it show. "My boys," he said. "Samuel is 12, Daniel is 9, little Cooper. He just turned 6. He exhaled slowly. "They've been ill since February. Dr. Aldrich Voss has been treating them. He's the county physician, been practicing here for nearly 20 years. Everyone trusts him. I trust him." A brief, complicated pause. I need to trust him. What are their symptoms? Eleanor asked. Gideon turned and began climbing the stairs, and she followed. Fatigue, weakness in the legs, headaches that don't quit. He lowered his voice as they reached the landing. Samuel's been losing hair. Started about 6 weeks into the treatment. Voss said it was a side effect of the medicine, said it would pass. He stopped outside a closed door and looked at the wood grain rather than at Eleanor. It hasn't passed. He opened the door. The room held 3 beds arranged along the walls, and the boys in them looked wrong, in the way that sick children always looked wrong. Too still, too pale, too quietly diminished, as if illness had been slowly erasing them from the outside in. Samuel, the eldest, was sitting up against his pillows with a book open in his lap, but he wasn't reading. He was watching the door with eyes that were sharp and careful and older than 12 had any right to be. His dark hair, or what remained of it, lay thin against his skull, and the skin of his face had a grayish undertone that made Eleanor's chest tighten. Daniel lay on his side, facing the window, asleep or pretending to be. He was slight and long-limbed, one arm hanging off the edge of the mattress. Cooper was awake, sitting cross-legged at the foot of his bed with a wooden horse in his hands, turning it over and over in the methodical way of a small child working through a large worry. When Eleanor walked in, he looked up at her with brown eyes so serious and trusting that something in her ribcage shifted painfully. Boys, Gideon said, this is Mrs. Hartwell. She's going to be staying here and helping out for a while. Hello, Samuel said. His voice was careful, assessing. Hello, Eleanor said. She moved to the empty chair between Samuel's bed and Cooper's, sat down in it naturally, without ceremony, as if she belonged there. What are you reading? Samuel glanced down at the book as if he'd forgotten it. Treasure Island. Good book. She paused. Though I always thought Jim Hawkins made some questionable decisions in the second half. Something flickered in Samuel's eyes. Surprise, or the ghost of amusement. He trusted the wrong people. He did, Eleanor agreed, holding the boy's gaze steadily. That's a dangerous thing to do. A silence. Gideon shifted in the doorway. Then Cooper held up his wooden horse and said, with perfect 6-year-old solemnity, his name is Admiral. That's a very distinguished name for a horse, Eleanor said. Cooper considered this and nodded. He's a very distinguished horse. The medicine came at noon. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard Dr. Voss arrive. The sound of an automobile she didn't recognize, a brief exchange of voices on the porch. She was at the window before she'd consciously decided to be, and she watched a man in his late 50s cross the yard toward the house with the measured, proprietorial walk of someone who expected deference. Aldrich Voss was not what she'd expected. He was silver-haired and broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that read immediately as trustworthy. Open, composed, with small wire-framed glasses that softened what might otherwise have been cold gray eyes. He dressed well for a county doctor. His shoes were expensive. He carried his medical bag with a practiced ease that suggested it was more prop than necessity. Eleanor stayed in the kitchen and listened. She heard Gideon's voice, lower and more deferential than it had been with her. She heard Voss's replies. Smooth, confident, seasoned with just enough warmth to land as genuine. She heard the sound of footsteps on the staircase, the creak of the boys' room door, and then a long silence. 20 minutes later, Voss came back downstairs alone. Eleanor stepped into the hallway. You must be the new housekeeper, Voss said, pausing on the bottom step. His smile arrived exactly on schedule. Gideon mentioned he'd hired someone. I'm Dr. Voss. Eleanor Hartwell. She kept her expression pleasantly neutral. I was just about to take the boys their afternoon water. Should I wait until after? The medication has already been administered, Voss said. Best to give it 30 minutes before anything else. The compounds work better on an empty stomach. He descended the last step, smoothed his jacket. Don't trouble yourself with the medicine, Mrs. Hartwell. That's strictly my domain. Your job is the house and the cooking. Gideon has enough to manage without you overstepping. The word overstepping was placed with surgical precision, gentle enough to seem offhand, pointed enough to land like a warning. Eleanor smiled. Of course, Doctor. He held her gaze for one beat longer than was socially comfortable, then turned and walked toward the front door, calling out a cheerful goodbye to Gideon in the study. Eleanor stood in the hallway and thought, there it is. She went upstairs to the boys 20 minutes later, as Voss had instructed, carrying a pitcher of water and 3 clean glasses. The change in them was subtle but unmistakable. Samuel, who had been alert and watchful an hour ago, was now lying flat, his eyes half-lidded with a heaviness that wasn't sleepiness. Daniel had rolled onto his back and was staring at the ceiling with unfocused eyes. Cooper, cheerful, composed Cooper with his distinguished horse, was now curled on his side with his knees pulled to his chest, his face slack with discomfort. "Does your stomach hurt, sweetheart?" Eleanor asked softly, crouching beside Cooper's bed. He nodded without opening his eyes. "It always does after the medicine," Samuel said from his bed. His voice was thicker now, slower. "Dr. Voss says it's normal. It means the treatment is working." "How long has it been doing that? Making your stomach hurt?" A pause. "Since the beginning." Eleanor poured water carefully, helped each boy drink, and tucked Cooper's blanket up around his shoulders. She made herself move slowly, made herself wear the same calm expression she'd worn sitting with her husband in those last hard months, the face of someone who was not afraid, even when she was. But as she straightened and turned to carry the empty glasses back to the kitchen, her eyes fell on the small tray on the dresser near the door. 3 medicine cups, empty now, and beside them, the brown glass bottle that Voss had left with Gideon for the evening dose. Eleanor stopped. She stood very still, because there was a smell in the room that she hadn't noticed when she first walked in, faint, almost covered by the camphor scent of the medicine itself, but there if you were paying attention. Sweet and metallic at the same time, with a chemical undertone that didn't belong anywhere near a sick room. She had smelled something like it once before, during a summer she'd spent helping her father-in-law strip old paint from a barn in the Carolina heat. He'd warned her to stay away from the industrial solvent he was using. "Smells almost sweet," he'd said, "but it'll rot you from the inside out." Eleanor looked at the brown glass bottle. She thought of Samuel's thinning hair. She thought of 3 boys who had been sick since February and were not getting better. She thought of a doctor who told her not to overstep. Then she went downstairs and began making supper, and she did not say a single word to Gideon Mercer because she understood, in the deep, quiet, devastated part of herself that had survived the unsurvivable, that what she said next had to be exactly right. 3 weeks passed. Eleanor learned the rhythms of Blackthorn Ranch the way she had always learned things, through careful attention and patient silence. She learned that Gideon rose before dawn and came in from the fields after dark, that he ate standing at the kitchen counter half the time because sitting down to a table felt too much like waiting for a family that wasn't there anymore. She learned that he spoke to his boys every evening in the low, careful tone of a man terrified of saying the wrong thing, and that he slept with his bedroom door open so he could hear them in the night. She learned the boys. Samuel she learned first and fastest, because Samuel was watching her with the same intensity she was watching everything else. He was a child who had been forced into premature wariness by circumstances, and she recognized in him something she recognized in herself, the look of someone who had decided they could not afford to be surprised again. "You ask a lot of questions," he told her one afternoon, when she brought him fresh water and sat in the chair beside his bed. "I was a teacher before I was a housekeeper," she said. "Old habits." He considered this. "What did you teach?" "Science, mostly chemistry and biology." A silence. Then Samuel said, carefully, slowly, as if testing each word before releasing it, "My stomach hurt again this morning, before Dr. Voss even came, just from thinking about the medicine coming." Eleanor kept her face very still. "Has it always been that way? The anticipation making you sick?" "Sort of. But lately—" He turned the edge of his book cover back and forth, a nervous habit she'd noticed. "Lately, I dream about it, the smell of it, and I wake up and my head is already pounding." "What does it smell like to you, the medicine?" He thought about it. "Like the stuff Dad uses to clean the tractor engine, but sweeter, like someone poured sugar over a machine." Eleanor set her water pitcher down very steadily on the nightstand. "That's a very precise description, Samuel. Is it bad?" He looked at her directly, and the question underneath the question was perfectly clear. "Is it bad that I told you this? Or is it bad that it smells like that?" Eleanor looked at him, at his thin hair and his careful eyes, and the shadows under his cheekbones that hadn't been in any photograph Gideon kept on the mantelpiece. And she made a decision she knew was going to cost her something. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I'm going to find out." The opportunity came on a Thursday. Voss arrived at his usual time, administered the midday doses, exchanged his usual pleasantries with Gideon, and left. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as his automobile disappeared down the drive, and then she counted to 100. Then she went upstairs. She had a small brown glass vial in her apron pocket, empty, carefully cleaned, sealed with a cork stopper she'd taken from the pantry. She moved quickly and quietly, her teacher's hand steady, and she tilted the boy's medicine bottle just far enough to fill the vial with perhaps half a teaspoon of liquid. She pressed the cork in. She slipped the vial into her pocket. Then she straightened the bottle exactly as it had been and walked back downstairs, as if she'd only gone up to check on the boys. Her heart was hammering. Her hands, when she looked at them over the kitchen sink, were not. She thought of her daughter. She thought of how illness had moved through Margaret's body like a tide, slow and then suddenly fast, and how Eleanor had trusted the doctors because trusting doctors was what you did, and how she had stood at a graveside 11 months ago in October, Rain wondering if she had failed in some fundamental way she couldn't even name. She pressed one hand flat against the kitchen counter. Not this time. Getting to town alone required patience and a degree of carefully constructed invisibility. Eleanor had been doing the weekly supply run for the ranch for 2 weeks now, ever since Gideon had recognized that the practical demands of running a household were consuming hours he needed in the fields. On Friday mornings, she took the truck to Harlan Town, a 15-mile round trip that took her through the county seat, past the sheriff's office, and the 2-story brick building that housed Voss's medical practice, and into the small commercial district where the general store, the post office, and a narrow pharmacy called Dunbar's sat in a row along the main street. She knew exactly where she was going. She had known since the first day she'd noticed Dunbar's from the truck window, had noted it the way she noted everything, cataloging details against possible future need. The pharmacist was a small, precise man in his early 60s named Harlan Dunbar. She'd spoken with him twice before about routine household supplies, and she had assessed him both times with the focused attention of someone who could not afford to misjudge. He was quiet. He was careful. He had the sort of eyes that moved slowly and saw quickly. She stepped inside on a Friday morning when the store was empty of other customers. "Mrs. Hartwell," Dunbar said, without particular surprise. "What can I do for you?" Eleanor set the vial on the counter between them without preamble. "I need to know what's in this," she said. "It's children's medicine. 3 children. They've been sick for months on it, and they're getting worse, not better." Dunbar looked at the vial. He looked at her face. He reached under the counter and put on a fresh pair of thin cotton gloves before he picked it up. "Who prescribed this?" "Dr. Voss." A silence that told her something. Dunbar's expression didn't change, but his eyes moved carefully away from hers and then back. And in that small movement, she saw something she recognized, the look of a man who had a thought he wasn't sure was safe to say aloud. "This may take a few days," he said. "I'll need to run some tests." "I'll come back Monday morning," Eleanor said. "Early, before the other customers." He nodded. He put the vial in his coat pocket close to his chest. Eleanor bought flour and lamp oil and a paper sack of coffee beans. She drove back to Blackthorn Ranch through the heat, through the cracked fields and the suffering trees, and she spent the weekend cooking and cleaning and reading to Cooper and asking Samuel careful questions and watching the boys take their medicine with their faces held in that particular resigned stillness that she was beginning to understand was not resignation at all. It was endurance. They had learned to endure it because no adult had yet given them a reason to believe they could stop. "Hold on," she thought, watching Cooper curl into himself after the evening dose, his small hands wrapped around Admiral the wooden horse. Hold on just a little longer. She had work to do. Sunday night, Gideon found her on the back porch after the boys were asleep. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then came out and sat on the step below hers, as he sometimes did, looking out at the dark fields. They had developed a kind of companionable silence between them over the weeks, the silence of 2 people who had been broken by loss and were, in the specific way of the very private, more comfortable with quiet honesty than with conversation. "Samuel told me something today," Gideon said. Eleanor waited. "He said you asked him about the smell of his medicine." He wasn't accusatory. He was feeling his way through the dark carefully, and she respected him for that. He said, "You seemed worried." "I am worried," Eleanor said. There was no point, she had decided, in soft-pedaling what she needed to say. "Gideon," she said his name deliberately, and he turned to look at her. "I'm going to tell you something on Monday that you're going to find very difficult to hear. I want you to know that before I have anything concrete to tell you, I can't say more than that, but I need you to trust me for one more day." He looked at her for a long time. The fields stretched dark and flat beyond the fence line, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote made its brief, lonesome announcement to the night. "You're not just a housekeeper," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "No," she said, "I'm not just anything." Another silence. Then Gideon Mercer looked back out at his land, at the fields his boys would run through again one day, if someone did the right thing, and nodded once. "Monday," he said. "Monday," Eleanor said. She folded her hands in her lap and watched the dark and thought about 3 small boys in beds upstairs, and about a brown glass bottle on a dresser, and about the smell of something sweet and wrong rising from 3 medicine cups every single day. She thought about endurance. She thought about what came after it. Monday came in gray and close, the sky pressing low over Harlan County, like it was listening. Eleanor was in the truck and on the road before 6, the fields on either side of the county road still buried in early morning shadow. She had slept poorly. Not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular alertness of someone who knows the day ahead will require everything they have. She had lain in the dark of her small room off the kitchen and run through possibilities the way she used to run through chemistry equations, methodically, without flinching from answers she didn't like. She parked on the side street beside Dunbar's pharmacy at 6:45 and waited. The town was still mostly asleep. A dog crossed the empty main street at one end and disappeared between 2 buildings. A light came on in the bakery 2 doors down, and the smell of bread reached her through the cracked truck window. Warm and ordinary, and so aggressively normal that it made the thing she was about to do feel, for just a moment, surreal. At 7 on the dot, Harlan Dunbar unlocked his front door. He saw her through the glass before the bell above the door had finished its single note, and the expression on his face told her everything she needed to know before he said a word. He turned the door sign to closed behind her. That told her the rest. "Sit down, Mrs. Hartwell," he said, moving behind his counter with the careful economy of a man managing something difficult. He set a small notepad on the counter between them, handwritten notes in a precise, tight script. He did not look at the notepad. He looked at her. "I'm going to tell you what I found, and I need you to stay calm while I do." "I'll stay calm," she said. He believed her, because he'd seen something in her face over the past 2 Fridays that people with fragile nerves did not have. He took a breath. "The sample you brought me contains therapeutic compounds. A legitimate base formula, yes, consistent with a general tonic prescribed for chronic fatigue." He paused. "It also contains compounds that have no business being in any medicine administered to children. Thallium-adjacent industrial derivatives, Mrs. Hartwell. Trace concentrations, carefully calculated, not enough to kill quickly, enough to cause progressive systemic damage over weeks and months." His voice was level, but his jaw was tight. "Hair loss, neurological symptoms, organ stress, stomach pain. The kitchen." The 3 boys curled into themselves after every dose. Cooper's small hands white-knuckled around a wooden horse. "How long?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was completely steady. "If they continue taking this, how long before—" "At current concentrations? Serious, likely irreversible damage within another 3 to 6 months. Dunbar removed his glasses and set them on the counter. Whoever formulated this knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't contamination. This isn't a compounding error. The concentration is too precise for that. The word precise landed in Eleanor's chest like a stone dropped into still water. "Have you seen anything like this before?" she asked. "In this county?" Another silence, longer this time. Dunbar picked his glasses up and put them back on, a gesture that felt less like habit and more like something to do with his hands while he decided how much to say. "There have been other children," he said finally, his voice dropping to just above the level of the ambient hum of the pharmacy's back room. "Other families, over the past 2 or 3 years. children with prolonged, unexplained illness, treatments that never quite worked. He met her eyes. I've had concerns before. I've had them privately, and I've kept them privately because... He stopped. Started again. Because Dr. Voss has been the county physician for 19 years, and I am one man with a pharmacy on a main street. And in this county, a man's reputation is either a shield or a weapon, depending on which side of it you're standing on. You were afraid, Eleanor said. Not an accusation, a recognition. I was practical, Dunbar said, and the way he said it made clear that he was no longer certain there was a difference. I don't have that luxury anymore, not with what you've just brought me. He pushed the notepad across the counter toward her. This is everything I found. Written out in plain language you can take to someone who matters. I'll testify to its accuracy if it comes to that. Eleanor picked up the notepad and looked at it. The handwriting was careful and thorough. Compound names, concentrations, clinical effects, a brief comparison to standard formulations. Everything a person with no medical background would need to understand what they were reading. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket beside her heart. Thank you, Mr. Dunbar, she said. Don't thank me, he said quietly. I should have done something sooner. We both know that. She left the pharmacy, turned the sign back to open on her way out, and walked to her truck in the gray morning light, with her hands folded and her mind running fast and her face giving nothing away to the empty street. She drove back to Blackthorn Ranch, and she did not stop at the sheriff's office. She had already decided she wouldn't. Not yet. Not until she understood the full shape of what she was dealing with. Because if Voss had been operating in this county for 19 years, and other children had been sick, and a careful, experienced man like Harlan Dunbar had kept his concerns to himself out of something he called practicality, then the question wasn't just what Voss was doing. The question was who else already knew. Gideon was waiting in the kitchen when she got back. He had made coffee. She could tell by the way the pot sat slightly off-center on the stove, the way it always did when someone else made it. He was standing at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, and he looked up when she came through the door with an expression that was barely holding its shape. She set her grocery bags on the counter. She put the coffee on properly. She poured 2 cups and set them on the table and sat down, and he sat across from her and she told him. She told him everything, the smell, Samuel's description, the vials she'd taken and why, what Dunbar had found and what it meant. She spoke in the same clear, unhurried way she had once explained chemical reactions to 16-year-olds, making sure every step was understood before moving to the next, leaving no room for comfortable misinterpretation. Gideon listened without interrupting. His coffee sat untouched. The hat in his hand stopped moving. His face went through several things: confusion, then a struggling disbelief, then something harder and more terrible, the look of a man watching the floor drop out from under everything he thought he knew. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. He's been treating them since February, Gideon said. The words came out slow, like he was lifting them from somewhere heavy. 9 months. Yes. My boys. He set the hat down on the table. His hands, freed of it, didn't know what to do. He pressed them flat on the tabletop. My boys have been lying up there, getting worse, and I've been... His voice broke on the last word and he stopped. He looked at the table. Eleanor watched him breathe his way through it. 3 long breaths, the way a man does when he refuses to break in front of someone but has no other choice but to stay in the room. You trusted your doctor, Eleanor said. That's not a failing, Gideon. That is what trust is. You gave it to someone who had not yet shown you he didn't deserve it. He showed me every week, Gideon said, and there was a terrible, quiet devastation in his voice. I just wasn't... You were a father trying to save his children, she said firmly. That is all you were. What comes next is what matters now. He looked up at her. His eyes were red at the rims but dry. The eyes of a man who had used up a great deal of what he had and was rationing what remained. What does this come next? Eleanor wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. We stop the medicine, today, right now, before Voss's afternoon visit. We tell the boys it's a change in treatment. We don't frighten them with the truth yet. And then, she paused, we need evidence beyond the vial and Dunbar's notes, something Voss can't discredit by questioning a housekeeper's motives and a small-town pharmacist's qualifications, something physical on this property. Gideon went very still in the way she'd learned meant he was thinking hard and fast. "The storage building," he said. What storage building?" "Down by the south fence line. Brick structure, been on the property since before I bought it. Voss asked me early on if he could use it for supply storage. Said the county medical office was short on space, said it was just excess stock, bandages, and basic supplies." His jaw tightened. "I said yes. I didn't think twice about it. I never went in there. He keeps it locked. And He stopped. "I trusted him." Eleanor set down her coffee cup. "Do you have a key?" she asked. "No. He has the only one." She thought for a moment. "A locked building on your own property," she said slowly, "that a man has been using for 2 years and has given you no key to. That's not a storage arrangement, Gideon. That's a hiding place." The words settled between them like a lit match. They stopped the medicine that morning. Eleanor carried the brown glass bottle downstairs herself, poured the contents carefully into a separate sealed jar she labeled and put in her own room, and replaced the bottle with a mixture of water and the mildest stomach tonic from the kitchen pantry, something that would look right in the cup and smell like nothing at all. She went upstairs and sat with the boys, and she told them the doctor had adjusted the treatment. "Does that mean we can stop taking it?" Cooper asked, his eyes wide with something that broke her heart. Hope. Barely daring to be hope. "For now," Eleanor said. "The new treatment is different. It might take a little getting used to." Cooper looked at her for a long moment, and then he said with devastating simplicity, "I don't think the old medicine was making me better." "I know, sweetheart," Eleanor said, and kept her voice so steady that she was proud of herself for it. "I know." Samuel, across the room, watched her with those careful old eyes and said nothing. But when she stood to leave, he said her name quietly. She turned. "Thank you," he said. Just that. No explanation, no elaboration. He had understood, and he was 12 years old and had understood, and Eleanor walked out of that room and stood in the hallway for 30 seconds with her eyes closed before she went back downstairs. Voss arrived at 1:30 in the afternoon. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard his car, and she stayed in the kitchen. She could hear him and Gideon in the front room, their voices too low to make out words, but the rhythm of the exchange detectable. Gideon had agreed to behave normally. She trusted him to do it. He was a man who had spent months holding himself together by sheer force of will. He could manage 20 minutes. Then she heard footsteps on the stair, and she heard the boys' room door open, and she heard the particular silence of a man discovering something unexpected. She moved quietly to the base of the staircase. Voss's voice, from above. "The medicine supply is low." Gideon's voice steady. Eleanor mentioned the boys seemed to have a reaction this morning. She replaced it temporarily with a gentler tonic, just for today. A pause. That's not her decision to make. She was concerned about them. "I'm their physician." The smoothness in Voss's voice had thinned slightly, like varnish over a crack. "I appreciate her attentiveness, but the treatment protocol is not something a housekeeper has the training to modify. I'll need to speak with her." "She's downstairs," Gideon said. Eleanor moved back to the kitchen before the footsteps reached the landing. She was at the stove when Voss came through the kitchen door. She heard him enter, heard him stop, and she took 3 full seconds before she turned around. 3 seconds to compose her face into something perfectly calibrated, attentive, pleasant, slightly deferential. The face of a woman who knows her place and is comfortable in it. "Dr. Voss," she turned with a small smile. "I was just about to put a kettle on. Can I offer you—" "You modified the boy's medication," he said. He was still smiling, but it was the smile of a man who had decided to use charm as a scalpel. "I understand you meant well, but these are seriously ill children on a carefully managed treatment regimen. Any interruption, even brief, can set back their progress significantly." "Of course," Eleanor said. "I'm sorry. Cooper seemed to be in more pain than usual this morning, and I panicked. You're absolutely right. It won't happen again." She watched his face, watched the smile re-solidify as he accepted the apology and recalibrated her as unthreatening. She had given him exactly what he wanted: submission, self-deprecation, an excuse to feel large. The easiest lies are the ones that tell people what they already want to believe about themselves. "I'll bring a fresh supply tomorrow," he said, his voice warming back to its practiced smoothness. "And Mrs. Hartwell—" He paused, letting the pause do the work. I know you've grown fond of the boys. It's natural, but their care is a medical matter. You do your best by them by keeping the house running well and leaving the clinical decisions to someone qualified to make them. He held her gaze for just a half second too long. Eleanor smiled pleasantly and said, I completely understand. He left. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window and watched his car move down the drive and turn onto the county road, and she allowed herself exactly 5 seconds of the fury she had been holding at arm's length since Monday morning. Then she folded it back up neatly and put it somewhere useful. That evening, after supper, after the boys were in bed, Eleanor and Gideon stood at the south fence line with a lantern and a bolt cutter Gideon had taken from the equipment shed. The storage building was squat and unremarkable. Brick walls, a heavy padlocked door, 2 small windows painted over from the inside. It sat in the shadow of an old oak tree at the far edge of the ranch property, and in the fading evening light it looked like nothing at all. Just a building. Gideon looked at the padlock. He looked at Eleanor. If I cut this lock, whatever's inside, Eleanor said, has been hidden on your property without your knowledge. You have every right to see what's on your own land. He nodded once and put the bolt cutter to the lock. The snap of it was loud in the evening quiet. The door swung open. The smell hit them first, sharp, chemical, industrial, the kind of smell that belonged in a factory and not anywhere near the word medicine. Eleanor raised the lantern and the light moved over the interior in a slow sweep. Wooden crates, a dozen of them stacked against the far wall, several with their lids loosened. Brown glass bottles by the case, dozens and dozens of them, identical to the ones Voss brought to the house. Glass jars with handwritten labels in a script that matched the bottles. And on a makeshift shelf along one wall, 3 large metal containers, the kind used for industrial solvent storage, their warning labels partially scraped away but not completely. Just enough remained to read the classification numbers underneath. Gideon stepped inside and crouched beside one of the open crates. He lifted a bottle, turned it, read the label. His hand was shaking slightly. How many? He said. It wasn't quite a question. His voice had gone to that place it sometimes went, flat and controlled and barely containing something enormous. Eleanor moved the lantern slowly around the room, counting. Enough for many children, she said quietly, for a long time. Gideon set the bottle down with a careful precision that was more frightening than if he'd thrown it. He stood up. He walked to the door and stood with his back to her, looking out at the dark fields, and his shoulders rose and fell once with a breath that was long and deliberate and laced with something she recognized as a man trying not to come apart. He's been doing this here, Gideon said, on my land, with my children, and I gave him the building. You didn't know. I keep saying that. He turned around. In the lantern light, his face was stripped of everything except what was underneath it. The raw, ferocious love of a father and the cold edge of what that love became when it had been wronged badly enough. At what point does not knowing stop being an excuse? It's not an excuse, Eleanor said. It's a fact. And it's the last irrelevant fact in this situation. Everything from this moment forward is a choice. She met his eyes steadily. We can go to the county sheriff, or Voss has had this county for 20 years, Gideon said. The sheriff, the county board, they've all had dinner at his table. I've had dinner at his table. His voice was bleak and furious at the same time. We go to the county, and evidence disappears before anyone with power sees it, and then we become the problem. I know, Eleanor said. So we go over them. We go around them entirely, Eleanor said. State investigators. Not a complaint, a submission. Physical evidence, Dunbar's analysis, my documentation of the boy's symptoms over the past 3 weeks, a formal statement from you as property owner. We package it so thoroughly that even if someone in this county tries to bury it, there's enough in state hands that burying it becomes impossible. Gideon looked at the crates. He looked at the bottles. He looked at Eleanor. You've been planning this, he said. Not accusing, recognizing. Since Monday, she said. Since I walked out of Dunbar's and decided not to stop at the sheriff's office. She paused. I've been wrong before, Gideon. I trusted systems I shouldn't have trusted. I'm not doing that again. Something crossed his face. A question he didn't ask aloud. A recognition of the weight behind that sentence. He knew about her husband. He knew about her daughter. He had never pressed her on either, and she respected him deeply for that. "All right," he said finally. "We do it your way." "We do it the careful way," she said. "We photograph what's here. We take additional samples. We document every detail tonight while it's untouched. And tomorrow," she paused, "tomorrow we send everything to the State Medical Review Board in the Capitol, registered mail, copies to the State Attorney General's office and the District Health Inspector. Multiple destinations. Too many fires to put out at once." Gideon looked at her in the lantern light, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Blackthorn Ranch, she saw something in his face that wasn't exhaustion or fear or carefully managed grief. It was the look of a man who had found solid ground. "You're remarkable. You know that?" he said quietly. Eleanor thought of a woman she had been 18 months ago, gutted, rudderless, sitting in an empty house in October rain with nowhere to be and nothing left to protect. She thought of how far that woman had walked to get here, to this building, to this lantern, to these crates full of terrible proof. "I'm motivated," she said, and held the lantern up higher so they could see everything clearly. They worked for 2 hours in the quiet dark, and by the time they relatched the broken door and walked back across the south field toward the house, they had everything they needed. Inside, upstairs, 3 boys slept without medicine in their blood for the first time in 9 months. And for the first time in 9 months, if Eleanor had to guess, they were sleeping a little easier. She thought they had earned it. She thought they all had. The packages went out on a Wednesday. Gideon drove them to the postal office in the next county over, and not Harlan, not anywhere Voss had roots. And Eleanor sat in the passenger seat with 3 identical manila envelopes on her lap, each sealed with wax and addressed in her clearest hand. The State Medical Review Board, the State Attorney General's office, the District Health Inspector's regional headquarters, 2 counties east. Same contents in each. Dunbar's written analysis, Eleanor's 3-week symptom log for all 3 boys, a notarized statement from Gideon as property owner, photographs of the storage building interior that Gideon had taken with the camera he kept in the ranch office desk, and a sealed evidence vial of the medicine. One of 3 additional samples Eleanor had taken before they relatched the building door that Monday night. She had spent 2 evenings writing the cover letter. She had written it the way she used to write lesson plans, clear structure, precise language. No emotional appeals, because emotional appeals gave readers an excuse to dismiss the writer instead of the evidence. She stated facts. She cited specifics. She let the compounds speak for themselves. Gideon slid the envelopes across the postal counter and paid for registered mail with return receipt, and neither of them spoke much on the drive back. The silence between them had changed over the past 3 days. It was no longer the silence of people managing their fear separately. It was the silence of 2 people who had made a decision together and were now living inside the weight of it. "How long do you think it takes?" Gideon asked, somewhere on the county road between the post office and home. "For the packages to arrive, 2 days. For someone to open them and understand what they're looking at." Eleanor looked out the window at the flat, sun-hammered land. "That depends on who opens them. If it lands on the right desk, a week. If it gets buried in a stack of routine complaints, longer." "And Voss comes back on Thursday." "Yes." "Can we keep the pretense going?" Eleanor thought about that honestly. "We have to. If he suspects the evidence has already left the county, he'll move faster. We need him to feel safe for as long as possible." She paused. "Tell him the boys had a mild night. Tell him the morning dose went smoothly. Keep everything ordinary." Gideon's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "You're asking me to look that man in the eye and behave as though—" "I know what I'm asking," Eleanor said quietly. "I know exactly what it costs. I'm asking anyway." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're very good at this." "At what?" "Asking hard things of people without pretending they're easy." Eleanor looked at her hands in her lap. "I learned it from someone who did the opposite," she said. "Spent 18 months being told things were fine when they weren't. It does something to you. You stop wanting the comfortable version." Gideon didn't ask who she meant. He understood, the way he always seemed to understand the things she said at an angle, the things that were really about her daughter or her husband. He simply nodded, and they drove the rest of the way in silence. And it was the most companionable silence Eleanor had felt in longer than she could easily measure. Thursday came with a low sky and the smell of distant rain that never arrived. Voss appeared at 1:15, precisely on schedule, and Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as he crossed the yard with his medical bag and his expensive shoes and his 19th year of county authority worn as naturally as a second skin. He had brought a fresh supply of medicine. She could see the familiar brown glass through the bag's open top as he climbed the porch steps. She stayed in the kitchen. She listened to the front room. Gideon's voice, measured and cooperative. Voss's voice, warm and reassuring. The particular performance of a man who believed he was still in control of every variable in his environment. Then footsteps on the stair. Then the boys' room. Then a pause. Eleanor pressed her back against the kitchen wall and breathed slowly. 5 minutes passed. 10. She heard murmured conversation from above. Voss's voice doing most of the talking, which was always the way. She heard Cooper's voice, a small bright thread underneath the deeper ones. She heard Samuel's voice, careful and flat, giving nothing. When Voss came back downstairs, he stopped in the kitchen doorway. "The boys look marginally better," he said. "Whatever tonic you gave them didn't seem to cause lasting disruption, so we'll count ourselves fortunate." The smile, the steady, calibrated warmth. "I've reinstated the regular protocol, morning and evening doses, as before." Eleanor turned from the stove. "I'm glad to hear they're doing better." She made herself meet his eyes. She made herself hold the contact for exactly the right duration. Attentive but not challenging, pleasant but not eager. She had taught herself this skill over the past week the way she had once taught herself to speak at a lectern without her hands shaking, through repetition and the understanding that what she felt inside was entirely irrelevant to what she needed the outside to communicate. Voss looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. She had noticed him doing this more frequently over the past 2 weeks. A subtle recalibration, as if he was running some internal calculation about her that kept coming back slightly off. She understood it, and she understood that the most dangerous thing she could do was let him see that she understood it. "You know," he said, conversational, almost offhand, "I had an interesting conversation with a colleague in town. He mentioned you'd been into Dunbar's pharmacy recently, more than the usual supply run." Eleanor let 2 full seconds pass before she responded. "Of course. Cooper had a rash last week. I picked up a calamine preparation." She tilted her head slightly. "Is that a concern, doctor?" "Not at all." The smile didn't waver. "I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about the boy's care. Supplements and preparations from outside the treatment protocol can interfere in ways that aren't always obvious." A pause. "I'd prefer to be consulted before you pick anything up going forward, just as a precaution." "Absolutely," Eleanor said. "That makes complete sense." He held her gaze one final beat. Then he said goodbye to Gideon in the study, collected his bag from the hallway table, and left. Eleanor let out a long, controlled breath and turned back to the stove. He knew something was wrong. Not yet. But the edge of his suspicion had found the edge of her composure, and the two had touched, briefly, and now he was paying attention in a way he hadn't been before. She could feel the shape of that attention the way you could feel a change in air pressure before a storm. She went upstairs. She took the morning and evening doses Voss had left and replaced them with the placebo mixture. She sealed his bottles and put them in the evidence jar she kept locked in her room. Then she sat with the boys for an hour, helped Cooper practice his letters, listened to Daniel read aloud from a book of animal facts he'd developed a recent passion for, played 2 games of checkers with Samuel, who beat her the first time through skill and the second time because she let him think he was beating her through skill. When she came back downstairs, she found Gideon in the study with the ranch ledger open on the desk, not reading it. "He knows," Gideon said. "He suspects," Eleanor corrected. "There's a distance between those 2 things, and we need to maintain it for as long as we can." "How long is that, do you think?" Eleanor sat in the chair across the desk. "He mentioned Dunbar's pharmacy. Someone told him I'd been there more than once." She paused. "Which means he has ears in town we didn't account for." Gideon leaned back in his chair. "There are men in Harlan who owe Voss favors, the kind of favors that make people very willing to pass along small pieces of information without knowing or caring why they're useful." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I've lived in this county for 11 years, and I still can't tell you exactly where his network begins and ends." "We don't need to," Eleanor said. "We just need the state investigators to move faster than his ability to clean up." She looked at the desk. at the ledger lying open to a column of numbers Gideon hadn't been reading. "How much do you know about his other patients, the other children Dunbar mentioned?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "There were 2 families, over in the Crestfield area. That's about 40 miles east. I heard something at the time, maybe a year and a half ago. A boy who died. They said it was a rare degenerative condition. Voss treated him." He stopped. "And the Halloran family, down in the South County. Twin girls. They recovered after one of them." Another stop. "One of them didn't." The kitchen clock ticked in the next room. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the smell of that distant rain still making its slow way toward them. 11 families, Eleanor said, almost to herself. That was the number she'd been building toward in her mind. The number of possible cases she'd extrapolated from what Dunbar had told her, from the geography, from the 19 years. "Maybe more. How do you live with that?" Gideon said. It wasn't rhetorical. He genuinely wanted to know. "How do you take that in and keep moving?" Eleanor looked at him. "You already know how," she said. "You've been doing it for 9 months. Every day your boys got worse, and you kept running this ranch and keeping this family alive. That's how. You make it fuel instead of weight." Gideon looked at her steadily for a long moment, and then he nodded, and there was something in his face that was not comfort but was honest. The look of a man who had been told a true thing and was choosing to accept it. 3 days later, 2 of those distant families came looking for answers on their own. Eleanor was hanging washing on the line when a truck she didn't recognize turned into the ranch drive. An older model, dusty from a long road, with a woman in the passenger seat and a man behind the wheel who had the same look Gideon had carried when Eleanor first arrived. That hollowed, load-bearing look. Their name was Beaumont, Calvin and Ruth. They had a daughter, 9 years old, currently bedridden in their farmhouse in the Crestfield area. She had been under Dr. Voss's care for 6 months. She was losing weight. She had headaches that didn't stop. She had begun losing hair. They had heard, through a chain of quiet conversation that Eleanor suspected led eventually back to Dunbar, that the woman out at Blackthorn Ranch might have some information worth hearing. Eleanor brought them inside. She made coffee. She sat across from them at the kitchen table the same way she had sat across from Gideon 4 weeks ago, and she told them what she knew, and she watched their faces make the same terrible journey his had made, disbelief traveling toward a devastated, furious recognition. Ruth Beaumont pressed both hands over her mouth halfway through and didn't take them away for a long time. Calvin Beaumont said nothing until Eleanor finished. Then he said, very quietly, "We paid him. Every visit. We thanked him. Ruth made him a pie at Christmas." "I know," Eleanor said. "Our daughter—" He stopped. Tried again. "Our daughter trusts him. She asks for him when she's frightened." "I know," Eleanor said again, because there was nothing else to say to that, and saying anything else would have been a kind of dishonesty. Ruth Beaumont lowered her hands from her face. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set. "What do we do?" "Stop the medicine today," Eleanor said. "Get a sample of whatever he's given you to Harlan Dunbar. He'll test it, and he'll document it, and he'll add it to what he already has." She paused. "And then I need something from you. I need your daughter's full symptom history written down, when it started, what Voss told you, what he changed, what he said when you asked questions, all of it." "For the state investigators?" Calvin asked. "More than one family is harder to dismiss than one family," Eleanor said. "More than one family, from more than one county, with documented evidence? That's not a complaint. That's a case." Ruth looked at her across the table with the look of a woman who had been afraid for a long time and was trying to locate the bottom of it. "Are you certain?" she said. "Are you certain about what you think he's doing?" Eleanor thought about the storage building, about the industrial solvent containers with the scraped labels, about Dunbar's handwritten notes in his precise, careful script, about Samuel saying it smells like machine cleaner but sweeter, and Cooper curling around his wooden horse every evening like a creature bracing for impact. "Yes," she said, "I'm certain." Something settled in Ruth Beaumont's face then. Not peace. It was too early for peace, and Eleanor suspected it was too early for a long time to come, but something that functioned like it. The particular relief of a person who has been carrying a terrible, half-formed fear entirely alone, and has just been told by another human being, "I see it too. You are not imagining it. You are not alone in this. They stayed for 2 hours. When they left, Eleanor stood on the porch and watched their truck turn back onto the county road, and she was still standing there when Gideon came up behind her. "They'll go to Dunbar?" he asked. "Today," she said, "and they know 2 other families. I told them to reach out carefully. No telephone, nothing that can be intercepted. Written notes, personal visits only." Gideon stood beside her on the porch, looking at the road where the Beaumont truck had disappeared. "You've turned this into something bigger than the 2 of us." "It was always bigger than the 2 of us," Eleanor said. "I just made it visible." The first sign that something was moving on the state end came 8 days after the packages were sent. It arrived in the form of a letter. No letterhead, which was deliberate, just an unsigned note on plain paper that read, "Your submission has been received and is under active review. Do not contact this office by telephone. Maintain current posture. Expect contact within 10 days. Eleanor read it twice, folded it, and put it in the lockbox she kept under the floorboard in her room. The one that now held Dunbar's notes, the evidence vials, Gideon's notarized statement, and a running log she'd been keeping in a composition notebook since the first Monday she'd walked out of the pharmacy. Active review, 10 days, she told Gideon. She watched his expression shift. Not relief, not yet, but the first loosening of something that had been pulled wire tight since the moment she'd sat across from him at the kitchen table and told him what his doctor had been doing. 10 days, he said. Maybe less, she said. And until then, Voss keeps coming. Voss keeps coming, she confirmed. And we keep being exactly what we've been. But the pressure was changing shape. She could feel it. On Tuesday, she noticed an unfamiliar car parked at the end of the ranch drive. Not in it, just off the county road, in the shade of the tree line, engine off. It was there when she went out to the garden at 8 in the morning and still there when she came back inside at 9. By 10 it was gone. She didn't mention it to the boys. She mentioned it to Gideon that evening in the low, steady voice she reserved for things that needed to be said without drama. He went to the window and looked at the dark drive. "Could be anyone," he said, but his jaw was tight. "It could be," Eleanor agreed, "but we should assume it isn't." From that night on, Gideon locked the ranch doors after dark. He had never bothered before. In 11 years on this land, in this county, he had slept with unlocked doors and thought nothing of it. He locked them now, and Eleanor noticed that he checked them twice before he went to bed, and she said nothing about it because some habits are not paranoia. They are pattern recognition, and pattern recognition, in a situation like this one, was a survival skill. The boys were getting better. It was not dramatic. There was no sudden morning where they bounded out of bed and the sickness was simply gone. It was slower and more honest than that. Cooper's stomach aches were less frequent by the end of the first week without real medicine. By the second week, Daniel was reading his animal facts books by the window instead of in bed. By the end of the third week, Samuel was sitting on the edge of his bed with his legs hanging over the side, which Eleanor noted in her composition book under the entry for that day, because it was the first time she had seen any of the 3 boys voluntarily put their feet on the floor. She mentioned it to Gideon at supper. He set his fork down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. At the floorboards of the room above where his boys were, at the architecture of the house between him and them, and his eyes were bright and full of something he was managing with visible effort, and Eleanor found something on her plate to look at to give him a moment of privacy with it. "He was going to kill them," Gideon said eventually. His voice was completely level. "That is what was happening. He was going to kill my boys." "Not quickly," Eleanor said. "He needed them sick, not dead. The longer the treatment continued, the more visits, the more fees. Death would have been a complication for him." She paused. "But yes, given enough time, the damage would have become irreversible." Gideon picked his fork back up. He ate in silence for a moment, and then he said something Eleanor didn't expect. "I want to testify," he said. "When it comes to that, I want to stand up and say what happened in this house, on this land, to my family. I don't want to be the man who sent a letter and waited in the background." Eleanor looked at him. "That may not be a safe choice," she said honestly. "Once this becomes public, Voss's people will push back hard. They'll come after anyone willing to stand up and be named." "I know. You have 3 boys who still need their father standing. I have 3 boys who need their father to be someone worth standing up for." He met her eyes directly, and his were clear and steady and decided. "I'm not asking your permission, Eleanor. I'm telling you my intention." She looked at him for a long moment, at the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands and the particular quality of his conviction, which was not impulsive or performative, but worn smooth with thought. The conviction of a man who had arrived at a decision the long way and was not going back. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. Outside, the wind moved through the cracked trees along the drive, and somewhere at the edge of the property, in the dark near the south fence line, the storage building sat locked and full of everything they needed, waiting for the people with the authority to use it. They would come. Eleanor believed that with a steadiness that had nothing to do with optimism and everything to do with the simple arithmetic of what she had built. Too many envelopes, too many destinations, too many families now moving in the same quiet direction. She believed it the way she had learned to believe the things she could not yet see but had constructed with her own hands. She believed it the way a woman believes in a house she has not yet finished building, but whose foundation she has already laid herself in ground she has already tested and found solid. It would hold. The state investigators arrived on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the packages were sent. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, driving an unmarked state vehicle that was nonetheless unmistakably official in the way it sat in the ranch drive, with its clean plates and its government-issue sameness. Eleanor watched them from the upstairs hallway window, her composition notebook tucked under her arm, and she allowed herself exactly one moment of something that wasn't quite relief, but was in the same territory. A loosening in the chest, a single breath that went all the way down. Then she went downstairs and opened the door before they knocked. The woman introduced herself as Senior Investigator Maren Cole, mid-40s, sharp-featured, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had spent years in rooms where people tried to make her doubt what she was looking at. She shook Eleanor's hand with a firm, no-performance grip and looked at her with eyes that were already working, already cataloging. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, "your submission was thorough. I want you to know that was not an accident on your part. That level of documentation is exactly what allowed us to move this quickly." "Come inside," Eleanor said. They sat in the ranch's front room. Cole and her 2 colleagues, Eleanor and Gideon, who had come in from the fields the moment Eleanor had sent Samuel running to find him. Gideon sat straight-backed in his chair with the quiet, compressed energy of a man who had been waiting for this moment for too long and was now managing the dangerous proximity of it. Cole opened a folder on her knee and looked at Eleanor directly. "I need to tell you what we know, and then I need to tell you what we still need, and then I need to tell you what comes next. All 3 of those things are important, and none of them are simple. Can you work with that?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "We've been running parallel inquiries since we received your submission. Dr. Aldrich Voss has treated patients in 4 counties over the past 6 years, under a regional contract arrangement that gave him access to a patient base far broader than any single county practice would provide." Cole's voice was even, factual, the voice of someone who had learned long ago that facts stated clearly were more devastating than any amount of emotional inflection. "In that time, we have now identified 17 children across 8 families who received treatments consistent with what you've described. Of those 17, 4 are deceased. The causes of death were attributed at the time to the underlying conditions Voss claimed to be treating." The room was completely silent. Gideon's hands on his knees were flat and still and white at the knuckles. "4 children," he said. "4 confirmed," Cole said. "We believe the actual number may be higher. That is part of what this investigation will establish." She paused, measured. "Voss is not operating alone. The chemical compounds identified in your sample and in 3 additional samples from other families require an industrial supply source and a compounding operation that is well beyond one physician's capacity. We are looking at a network, suppliers, a secondary compounder, and we believe at least 2 other medical practitioners who were either directly involved or willfully blind to what they were participating in." Eleanor had suspected this. She had held the suspicion at a careful distance from certainty for weeks, because certainty without evidence was just another form of fear. But hearing it stated plainly by a state investigator in her front room made it real in a different way, made it the kind of real that settled into the bones. "What do you need from us?" she asked. "Access to the storage building, formal statements from both of you, recorded and signed, the full evidence collection you've been maintaining." Cole looked at Eleanor's notebook. And your testimony, Mrs. Hartwell, when this goes to prosecution, both of yours. Gideon said, "We already decided we'd testify." Cole looked at him. "I want to be honest with you about what that means. This case will attract significant attention. Voss has practiced in this region for 19 years, and he has relationships, professional, social, financial, with people who will not want those relationships examined. When a man like that is publicly accused, the first thing his defense does is attack his accusers." She looked between them steadily. "They will look at everything, both of your histories, your backgrounds, your motives, your credibility. They will find things to use. Everyone has things that can be used." A silence. "I buried a husband and a daughter," Eleanor said. "Both in the same year. My daughter was 11. She died of a pulmonary illness that was diagnosed late because the first physician we consulted missed it, and I spent 2 years after that wondering what I could have done differently." Her voice was steady and clear, and she kept her eyes on Cole throughout. "If Voss's attorneys want to use my grief as a reason to disbelieve me, they're welcome to try. I've carried it for long enough that it doesn't frighten me the way they'll need it to." Cole held her gaze for a moment. Then she wrote something in her folder and said, "All right." The investigation moved quickly after that, and the pressure around Blackthorn Ranch moved with it. The morning after Cole's visit, a different car appeared at the end of the drive. Not the same vehicle that had sat in the tree line 2 weeks earlier, but the same intent made visible. It stayed for 4 hours and drove away slowly when Gideon walked toward it. That evening, Eleanor found the latch on the storage building had been tampered with. Not opened, the evidence still intact, but the lock scratched in the way a lock is scratched when someone has been working at it with the wrong tools in a hurry. She photographed the scratches and called Cole's office from the postal phone in the next county. Cole had the building sealed and its contents transferred to state custody by the following afternoon. 2 days after that, Voss came for his regular visit. It was the last time he came. Eleanor was upstairs with the boys when she heard his car, and she stayed where she was deliberately, letting Gideon handle the front door alone. She heard the porch, the hallway, the brief exchange of voices. Gideon's controlled and even, Voss's starting smooth and going careful as he picked up on something wrong in the temperature of the room. Then she heard Gideon say clearly enough to Carrie, "I think you should leave, Dr. Voss. I don't require your services anymore." A pause. Then Voss's voice modulated carefully between confusion and concern. "Gideon, if the boy's treatment is interrupted at this stage, get off my property." Gideon's voice had gone very quiet, and Eleanor had learned by now that when Gideon Mercer went quiet, he was at his most serious. "I won't say it again." A longer pause. Then the sound of the door and the porch and the car. Eleanor sat in the chair between Samuel's bed and Cooper's and looked at her hands. Samuel was watching her. He had been watching her, she knew, with increasing understanding over the past several weeks, tracking the small changes in the household's atmosphere, the locked doors, the visitors, the shift in his father's bearing from frightened to something harder and more forward-facing. He was 12 years old, and he had been ill for 9 months, and he was one of the sharpest people Eleanor had ever met, regardless of age. "Is it over?" he asked. "The part where we gather evidence is over," Eleanor said. "The part where we use it is starting." Samuel absorbed this with the quiet, considered manner that was entirely his own. "Will they try to say you made it up?" Eleanor looked at him. "Yes, they'll try." "Will it work?" "No," she said. "It won't." Samuel looked at her for a long moment, with those careful, old-for-12 eyes. Then he said something that Eleanor would think about for a very long time afterward. "My mom was sick too," he said, "before she died. Different sick. But I remember being little and thinking that if I just watched carefully enough, I'd see what was wrong, and then someone would be able to fix it." He paused. "I couldn't see it. I was too small." "Samuel," Eleanor said softly. "But you could see it," he said. "You came here and you could see it." His voice was entirely steady. "I want you to know that I know that. Whatever they say about you in court or wherever, I know what you did. I was here." Eleanor looked at this boy, this thin, watchful, remarkable boy sitting up in a bed he had been confined to for 9 months. And she felt something move through her chest that was not grief and not happiness, but was in some way the overlap of both, the place where loss and meaning occupied the same space and neither canceled the other out. "Thank you," she said. "That matters more than I can tell you." Cooper, from his bed, held up Admiral the wooden horse in Eleanor's direction. It was, she had learned, his highest form of endorsement. She laughed, a real laugh, unexpected. And something in the room shifted, loosened, breathed. The arrest came on a Tuesday. Eleanor learned of it secondhand. Cole called the ranch that afternoon to tell them that Voss had been taken into custody at his county office at 9 that morning and that simultaneous arrests had been made in 2 other counties. A pharmaceutical supplier named Hargrove, who operated out of an industrial complex 40 miles north, and a compounder named Dietz, who had been providing the altered formulations through a secondary distribution channel that was ostensibly a medical supply company. 2 other physicians had been brought in for questioning. Neither had been charged yet. Cole did not speculate on whether they would be. "The arraignment will be within the week," Cole said. "Trial preparation will take several months. I'll be in contact about testimony scheduling." Eleanor hung up the phone in the ranch office and sat for a moment in Gideon's chair, in the room where she had first sat across from him almost 2 months ago and watched his face make the journey from hope to devastation. The leather of the chair was worn smooth at the arms, and she rested her hands on it and looked at the window and thought about the shape of what was coming. Several months of trial preparation, attorneys who had been paid to dismantle people on a stand, her history laid out in a courtroom for the purpose of making it a weapon against her. Her daughter's death, her husband's. The years of grief that she had lived through without grace or ease, but with a dogged, relentless honesty that had not, in the end, broken her. She had told Cole it didn't frighten her. That had been mostly true. It was not that the prospect didn't carry weight. It was that she had carried heavier things and was still here, still upright, still moving forward. And the weight of the past was something she understood the architecture of by now. She knew where it sat and how to distribute it so that it did not buckle her. What she had not told Cole was the other thing, the thing underneath the testimony and the evidence and the procedural machinery of justice. The thing that had nothing to do with Voss or the courtroom or the state investigators. She was still the woman who had failed to save Margaret. That was the deepest truth she carried, and it was the one that the most skilled attorney in the world could not weaponize against her, because she had already tried every angle herself and she knew its full shape. She had not been negligent. She had trusted the wrong person, and she had lost her daughter anyway. And the only answer to that, the only one she had ever found that bore any weight at all, was to be in the next room when the next child needed someone who was paying attention. She was that person. She had been that person here. It was not redemption. She did not believe in a clean accounting between loss and action, but it was something real, something that carried its own unassailable logic, and it was enough to stand on. She went to find Gideon. The preliminary hearing was held 6 weeks later in the county seat, and it drew the kind of attention that small towns reserve for disasters, quiet and total. Everybody watching from the edges, waiting to see which structures held and which ones fell. Eleanor sat in the second row of the courtroom gallery beside Harlan Dunbar, and across the aisle from Ruth and Calvin Beaumont, who had come with their daughter, recovered now, nearly fully recovered, with color in her face and a 9-year-old's impatient energy barely contained by the formality of the proceedings. 2 other families sat behind them. 3 more had submitted written statements they had not had the protection to deliver in person. Voss sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than a month of ranch wages. He had retained Wallace Gritt, a defense attorney from the Capitol, whose reputation for courtroom demolition was well established and well funded. Gritt was a tall, silver-tongued man with the particular brand of confidence that came from winning enough times to believe it was inevitable. He moved through the preliminary hearing with an easy precision, objecting selectively, laying groundwork. Eleanor watched him and noted everything. The charges were read: criminal conspiracy to commit harm, willful administration of toxic substances, fraud, negligence resulting in death, 4 counts of the last, with the possibility of additional counts pending. The courtroom was very still through the reading. Somewhere behind Eleanor, she heard a woman make a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a word. Then Gritt rose and delivered his opening statement, and Eleanor understood in the first 5 minutes exactly how the defense intended to run this. The narrative Gritt constructed was smooth and technically sophisticated and ruthless in its logic. A grieving, unstable widow with a history of loss and a demonstrated pattern of disproportionate anxiety about medicine, A woman who had lost a child to illness and had never fully recovered from the trauma of that loss, had attached herself to a vulnerable household and manufactured a crisis that confirmed her worst fears. The pharmacist had acted on her characterization of the sample rather than objectively. The evidence in the storage building was industrial supply stock, legally obtained, that the defendant had stored in good faith on private property with the owner's permission. It was a clean practice dismantling, and it worked from the outside in, starting with Eleanor's credibility and working backward toward the evidence. Because if Eleanor was compromised, Dunbar was compromised by association, and if Dunbar was compromised, the chain of custody for every sample became contestable. Eleanor sat in the gallery and listened and kept her face entirely still. Beside her, Dunbar said under his breath, "He's going to come for you hard." "I know," Eleanor said. "Can you hold?" She looked at the defense table, at Grit finishing his statement with the easy fluency of a man who had done this many times, and at Voss beside him, sitting with his hands folded, his expression composed, still wearing the mask of a trustworthy man so completely that she could see how 19 years had been possible, how a person could look at that face and find nothing to question. "I've been holding for 2 years," she said quietly. "I have excellent form." The trial itself was 4 months in preparation and 9 days in the courtroom. On the 6th day, Grit called Eleanor to the stand. She had known this was coming since the preliminary hearing. She had prepared for it the way she used to prepare for difficult conversations with parents who didn't want to hear that their child was struggling, with complete honesty about what would be hard, and complete clarity about what she would not surrender. Cole's team had walked her through the likely attack lines. She had listened carefully and filed everything away, and not slept particularly well for the week before her testimony, which she accepted as the reasonable cost of feeling things. She took the stand in the gray morning light of the courtroom and looked at the room, at the jury of 12 faces, at the families in the gallery, at Gideon in the second row with Samuel beside him, because Samuel had asked to come and Gideon had said yes without hesitation. At Cooper and Daniel, who were home with a neighbor, too young for this room, but very much present in the reason for it. Grit came at her methodically and without theater. He was, she had to acknowledge, very good at this. He established her background, her teaching career, her husband's death, her daughter's death, including the physician's delayed diagnosis. He built the picture carefully, brick by brick, a woman shaped by medical trauma, by institutional failure, by loss that had never been fully processed. "And when you arrived at Blackthorn Ranch," he said, "you had been unemployed for how many months?" 7 months. "And you had no formal medical training." "No formal medical training." "And no pharmacological background." "I taught chemistry and biology for 14 years, Eleanor said. "I am not a pharmacist. I am also not incapable of recognizing when a chemical compound does not belong in a child's medicine." A slight shift in Grit's expression, barely perceptible, but Eleanor was watching for it. He moved on. He came at her from the grief angle twice more. The daughter's death, the lost months, the suggestion of fixation. Each time, Eleanor answered him directly, simply, without defensiveness, and without the emotional flair that he was angling for. She understood what he needed from her, a display of fragility or anger that the jury could read as instability. She had decided before she sat down that she would not give him either. On the 3rd attempt, Grit said, "Mrs. Hartwell, isn't it possible that your history, your very understandable, very human history of loss related to medical care, made you predisposed to see a threat that wasn't there?" Eleanor looked at him steadily. "My history," she said, "made me predisposed to pay attention, to notice things that people who had not lived what I had lived might have dismissed or explained away." She paused, and the courtroom was very quiet. Aldrich Voss was counting on the people around those children to trust him and not look too closely. He had 19 years of practice building that trust. The fact that I looked closely anyway, the fact that losing Margaret made me the kind of person who could not stop watching, could not stop asking questions, could not stop following the smell of something wrong until I understood what it was. Her voice was clear and level and absolutely unflinching. "If that is a liability, then I am proud to carry it." The courtroom was completely silent for 3 full seconds. Grit said, "No further questions," and sat down. And Eleanor noticed that the jury, all 12, almost simultaneously, had shifted very slightly in their seats, the way people do when something lands solidly and cannot be walked back. Gideon, in the second row, had his hands clasped in his lap. Samuel was sitting straight beside him. He caught Eleanor's eyes as she stepped down from the stand, and he gave her a single small nod. The nod of a 12-year-old who had understood everything and was bearing witness to it. She walked back to her seat and sat down and folded her hands in her lap and did not let herself feel anything large until she was alone that night in the small room off the kitchen at Blackthorn Ranch, lying in the dark with her composition notebook on the nightstand and the sound of 3 boys breathing in rooms above her. Then she let herself feel it, all of it, the grief and the exhaustion and the satisfaction and the fear and the particular fierce, aching pride of a woman who had stood up in a room full of powerful people who wanted her to fall and had not fallen, who had been Margaret's mother and Robert's wife, and a broken, wandering woman with a leather suitcase and nowhere particular to go, and who had walked into a ranch house in the middle of a long, mean summer and had been, finally, in the exact right place at the exact right time, with the exact right history to do the one thing that needed doing. She lay in the dark and breathed and let the tears come, and they were not the grief tears she had been living with for 2 years. They were something different, something that had no clean name, something that lived at the boundary between what had been lost and what had been built from the wreckage of it. Outside her window, the summer was finally breaking. She could hear it in the wind, cooler now, carrying the smell of coming rain that would actually arrive this time, that would actually fall. Tomorrow, the prosecution would deliver its closing argument. She had already read the draft. It was good. It was very good. It had her words in it, and Dunbar's, and Gideon's, and the careful, devastated testimony of 6 families who had sat in that courtroom and told the truth about what a trusted man had done to their children. It was enough. She believed that the way she believed in houses built on solid ground. She closed her eyes and slept. The rain came in the night and was still falling softly when the jury returned their verdict on the morning of the 9th day. Eleanor was awake before the ranch house stirred, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, listening to the rain work its way through the gutters and drip from the porch eaves in a steady, unhurried rhythm. After months of a summer that had pressed down on Harlan County like something punitive, the rain felt like a change in the nature of things. Not dramatic, not sudden, just the quiet arrival of a season that had been a long time coming. Gideon came downstairs at 6 and found her there. He poured his own coffee and sat across from her without a word, and they sat in that particular silence for a while. The silence of 2 people who had said most of what needed to be said and were now simply waiting together for the world to confirm or deny what they believed to be true. Samuel appeared at the kitchen doorway at 6:30 in his pajamas, his hair grown back now in dark, thick waves that were nothing like the thin remnants she had first seen on his pillow months ago. He looked at the 2 of them sitting at the table with their coffee and said, with the pragmatic directness that was entirely his own, "Today's the day." "Today's the day," Gideon confirmed. Samuel got himself a glass of water, leaned against the counter, and said, "I'm not going to school." Gideon looked at him. "Samuel, I was poisoned for 9 months, and I testified in a state criminal trial," Samuel said. "I think I've earned a day off from arithmetic." Eleanor pressed her lips together very firmly over a smile. Gideon looked at his eldest son for a long moment with an expression that was trying to be firm and losing the argument against affection, and then he said, "Fine, but you're doing the chicken feed." "Already did it," Samuel said, and took his water back upstairs. Eleanor let the smile out then, and Gideon shook his head slowly, and for a brief and ordinary moment the kitchen was just a kitchen, and they were just 2 people who had gotten used to the specific pleasure of each other's company, and the weight of what the day held lifted just slightly, just enough to breathe around. The courthouse was full by 8:30. Eleanor sat in the front row of the gallery this time. Cole had arranged it, a small acknowledgement of what Eleanor had contributed to the case that was stated without sentiment and accepted the same way. Beside her sat Gideon, solid and still in his good shirt, and beside him sat Samuel, who had come after all because no one had seriously believed he wouldn't. Behind them, the Beaumont family occupied an entire bench. Calvin and Ruth and their daughter Nora, who at 9 years old had no legal reason to be in a criminal proceeding, but had, according to Ruth, informed her parents that she would be in attendance regardless of their preferences on the matter. The other families were there. All of them, or nearly. Some Eleanor knew by name now, and some she knew only by their letters. The correspondence that had been building quietly over the months of trial preparation. Families from 4 counties who had found each other through the network that had begun with Eleanor's envelopes and Dunbar's careful conversations and the Beaumonts' quiet outreach. They filled the gallery in a way that was not a crowd, but a weight. A collective, human, specific weight that sat in the room and could not be ignored. Harlan Dunbar sat at the end of Eleanor's row with his hands on his knees and his glasses newly polished, looking like a man who had decided that being here in person was a form of reparation for not having been here sooner, and who had made that decision without self-drama and was simply honoring it. The jury filed in at 8:57. Eleanor watched the foreperson, a woman in her 50s, a farmer's wife from the east side of the county, who had sat in that box for 9 days with an expression of focused, unsparing attention that Eleanor had found reassuring from the first day. She watched her now and tried to read nothing into the set of her face, because she had learned long ago that reading faces before the words came was a way of tormenting yourself with your own projections. The judge asked for the verdict. The foreperson stood. The room held its breath. On the charge of criminal conspiracy to commit willful harm, guilty. On the charge of deliberate administration of toxic substances to minors, guilty. On the charge of fraud and medical malpractice in the first degree, guilty. On 4 counts of negligence resulting in death, a pause that was probably only 2 seconds long and felt like a season. Guilty on all 4 counts. The room did not erupt. It exhaled, a long, collective, shuddering release that moved through the gallery like a wave, and in the middle of it, Eleanor heard Ruth Beaumont make a sound behind her that was grief and relief collapsed into the same breath, and she heard Calvin say his wife's name low and soft, and she felt Gideon's hand find hers on the bench between them and grip it once, briefly and firmly, before he let go. She looked straight ahead and breathed. At the defense table, Wallace Gritt sat with his pen capped and his folder closed, and his face arranged in the careful neutrality of a professional managing a loss. Beside him, Aldrich Voss sat very still, and Eleanor allowed herself one long look at him. At the face she had first seen crossing the ranch yard with its expensive shoes and its practiced warmth, the face she had learned to read past and beneath, the face of a man who had looked at sick children for 19 years and seen an income stream. And then she looked away. She had no interest in watching him receive what he deserved. She had spent everything she had on making sure it arrived. What happened to him once justice caught him was justice's business, not hers. The sentencing, handed down 3 weeks later, was reported across the state. Voss received 42 years for the combined charges, with no possibility of parole on the death counts. Hargrove, the supplier, received 27 years. Dietz, the compounder, received 19. Of the 2 physicians who had been brought in for questioning, one was charged as an accessory and received a 7-year sentence. The other was found to have had insufficient knowledge of the compound alterations and was stripped of his medical license and placed on probation. The state medical board, responding to the scale of what the trial had exposed, enacted an emergency review of all regional treatment protocols within 60 days of the verdict. New requirements were established. Independent pharmaceutical verification for any compound medication prescribed to minors, mandatory second opinion consultations for children showing treatment-resistant symptoms, and a new whistleblower protection structure specifically covering non-medical household caregivers, a category that had not previously existed in the state's medical oversight code. That last provision was named informally in the state health department's internal documents and eventually in the press coverage that followed as the Hartwell provision. Eleanor learned about the name from Cole, who called the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon to tell her, and who delivered the information in the same level, precise voice she used for everything, as if it were simply a fact among facts. Eleanor stood in the ranch office with the phone in her hand and said nothing for a moment. "Mrs. Hartwell," Cole said. "I'm here," Eleanor said. She stopped. "That's not something I expected." "The board thought it was appropriate," Cole said. "You documented everything. You thought systematically when you had every reason to think emotionally. You found a way to make the evidence matter even when the system closest to you was compromised." A brief pause. "That's not common. It deserves a name." Eleanor set the phone down after they said goodbye and stood in the ranch office for a long time, looking at the wall where Gideon kept a photograph of the ranch from before he bought it. The house without the porch furniture, the fields unbroken, the tree line younger. And she thought about Margaret. She thought about Margaret the way she had learned to think about her over these months, not with the guillotine drop of the rawest grief, but with something older and more settled, the thought of a child held rather than the thought of a child lost. She thought about what Margaret would have been at 11, at 12, at Samuel's age, curious and particular in all the ways Eleanor could still clearly see, even now. She thought about the illness that had taken her and the physician who had missed it, and the months of believing the reassurances that came too late and too false. She thought, "You are the reason I knew what I was smelling. You are the reason I couldn't stop looking. You are the reason those boys are alive." It was not comfort, exactly, but it was a different shape than grief, and she was learning to live inside it. 6 months after the verdict, on a clear October morning with the light coming in low and gold across the blackthorn fields, Eleanor watched Cooper run. He came out the back door at full speed and hit the yard at a flat-out sprint that had no direction and no destination. The pure, extravagant running of a 7-year-old who had recently rediscovered what his legs were for. Daniel was 20 feet behind him, taller and faster, whooping something unintelligible. They curved around the fence post at the garden's edge and headed for the south field, and Eleanor, standing on the back porch with her second cup of coffee, watched them go and felt something move through her that was warm and simple and required no analysis. Samuel came out behind her and stood at the porch railing. "He's going to trip and faceplant in about 30 seconds, Samuel said, watching his youngest brother tear across the field. "He'll get up," Eleanor said. "Obviously," Samuel said, with the particular tone of a 13-year-old who found it faintly unnecessary to state the obvious. Then, after a moment, "You're staying." It wasn't a question. It had the quality of something already decided. Not by anyone in particular, but by the accumulation of months and meals and early mornings and long evenings, and the specific, unremarkable weight of a life that had been built up slowly around all of them, without any single moment of formal decision. "I'm staying," Eleanor said. Samuel nodded, as if confirming a figure he'd already calculated. "Good," he said, and went back inside, letting the screen door close behind him with its familiar slap. Eleanor turned back to the fields. Cooper had not, in fact, face-planted. He had reached the fence line and was now hanging off the top rail with his arms out. And Daniel was telling him something that was making him laugh, a sound that carried clean and bright across the morning air, the laugh of a 7-year-old boy who was well and whole and living fully inside the ordinary miracle of his own body working the way it was meant to. Eleanor thought about the afternoon she had arrived at this ranch, the cracked road, and the suffering trees, and the house that looked like it had forgotten how to be a home. The hollowed, load-bearing man who had met her on the porch steps and shaken her hand and said, "There are things you should know first," with the face of a father who was frightened and doing his best anyway. She thought about the bedroom with 3 beds and 3 boys who had looked wrong in the quiet, diminished way of children who had been made sick by a person they trusted. She thought about the small tray on the dresser and the brown glass bottle and the smell, sweet, metallic, wrong, that had risen from 3 medicine cups and landed in a part of her that had been sharpened by loss into something precise and reliable, and it turned out necessary. She thought about Harlan Dunbar, who had kept his concerns privately for too long and had then, when it mattered, done the right thing without flinching. She had seen him twice since the trial, once at the pharmacy, once at a community meeting the state health department had organized in Harlan to explain the new oversight provisions. He had been the same both times, quiet, precise, honest about what he had gotten wrong before, and clear about what he intended to do differently. She respected him more for that than for anything else. She thought about Ruth and Calvin Beaumont and their daughter Nora, who was in 3rd grade now and had sent Eleanor a letter 2 months ago that was 3 sentences long and contained a drawing of a horse that bore some resemblance to Admiral. Eleanor had put it on the kitchen windowsill. She thought about the 11 families, the confirmed total now, after the state investigation completed its full canvass of Voss's patient history across 4 counties over 6 years. 11 families, 17 children with documented harm. 4 who would not grow up to run across fields in October light, or hang off fence rails or learn to read their father's silences. She did not look away from that number. She had decided early on that looking away from it would be a form of dishonesty she couldn't afford, that the 4 children who had died deserved to be held in the full weight of what they were, not folded into the background of the story that had ended better for the rest. Their families had testified. Their names had been read in open court. The charges that carried their deaths had carried the heaviest sentences, and that was right, and it was also not enough. And both of those things were permanently true and could not be resolved into something tidier. Eleanor held them, held all of it, with the practiced, aching care of a woman who had learned that some weight was not meant to be set down. Gideon found her on the porch that evening, after the boys were inside and the light had gone from gold to long purple. He came out with 2 cups of coffee, a habit they had fallen into months ago without discussing it, and sat in the second chair, and they watched the last of the daylight leave the fields the way they had watched many evenings by now. "I got a letter today," he said, after a while, "from the State Health Board. They want me to sit on an advisory panel, something to do with the new oversight provisions. They want input from affected families about how the reporting structure should work in rural counties." Eleanor looked at him. "Are you going to do it?" "I think so." He looked at the fields. "I'm not a natural public person, but I know what the inside of this thing feels like, and they need people who know that." He paused. "You turned something terrible into something that changed the rules. I'd like to help keep the rules changed." Eleanor thought about the name on the provision. She had not told Gideon about it yet. Cole had only called that morning, and the day had moved forward in its ordinary way before she'd found a moment. She told him now, simply, without ceremony. He was quiet for a moment. "That's something," he said. "It's something," she agreed. Another pause. The fields were nearly dark now, and the first stars were showing above the tree line, and from inside the house came the sound of Samuel's voice reading aloud to Cooper, a nightly ritual that had begun 3 months ago when Cooper, emboldened by his returning health, had decided he wanted to hear Treasure Island, and Samuel had taken the responsibility seriously enough to make it a proper production. "Margaret," Gideon said. It was the first time he had ever said her daughter's name aloud, and Eleanor looked at him. "You talk about her sometimes," he said quietly, "in the edges of things, the things you say that are really about her." He met her eyes with the directness that was his nature, the direct, unhurried honesty of a man who had no patience for performing emotions he didn't have and no interest in hiding the ones he did. "She sounds like she was remarkable." Eleanor looked at the first stars above the tree line. She felt the familiar weight shift slightly in her chest. Not lighter, never lighter exactly, but differently held. "She was particular," Eleanor said. "That's the word I keep coming back to. She was very particular about things. The specific shade of a color, the exact right word for a feeling. She would reject 5 words before she found the one she wanted." She paused. She would have liked Samuel. They would have driven each other absolutely crazy, and they would have been very good friends. Gideon smiled. A real one, slow and warm. "I think you're right about that." "She would have loved Cooper unconditionally," Eleanor continued, "and Cooper would have followed her everywhere, and Daniel would have pretended not to care and then told her everything." She stopped. Her voice had remained even throughout, which surprised her slightly. She was 11. She would be 13 now. She would be exactly the age where everything is complicated, and she would have handled it by thinking about it more precisely than anyone around her. "She sounds like her mother," Gideon said. Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at her with the steady, open expression he wore when he meant something simply and completely, without decoration. And she understood that it was one of those moments, the moments that had been accumulating between them for months, quietly and without announcement, like water rising to a level that eventually becomes undeniable. "Gideon," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking anything of you. I just want you to know that I—" He stopped, the way he sometimes did, searching for the right word with a care that she had come to recognize as his version of what Margaret used to do. "I see you," he said finally, "all of what you are, where you came from, what you've lost, what you've built from it. I see it, and I think it is the most remarkable thing I have ever been close to." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. From inside the house, Samuel's voice rose and fell with the cadence of Jim Hawkins on the Hispaniola, and Cooper made a sound of delighted alarm at something in the story, and Daniel said something dryly skeptical that she couldn't quite make out, and the ordinary beautiful sound of it moved through the walls of the house and into the evening air and across the porch where she was sitting. "I came here with nothing," she said finally. "I had a leather suitcase and nowhere particular to go, and I thought—" She paused. "I thought maybe if I could be useful somewhere, it would be enough. Just enough. I wasn't looking for more than that." "And now?" Gideon asked. Eleanor looked at the dark fields and the bright stars above the tree line and thought about the shape of a life. Not the life she had planned or the life she had lost, but the one that had assembled itself around her while she was busy paying attention to everything else. The composition notebook in her room, now full and starting a second. The drawing of a horse on the kitchen windowsill. The Hartwell provision in a state health code. 3 boys sleeping in rooms above her head. The man beside her holding his coffee, watching her with patient and honest eyes. "Now," she said, "I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think so too." They sat on the porch as the night settled fully around the ranch, and the stars multiplied above the fields, and the house behind them breathed with the small, ordinary sounds of children who were alive and well and unafraid. The sounds that Eleanor had fought for in a storage building by lantern light, and in a courtroom under the scrutiny of ruthless men, and on a witness stand where she had refused, quietly and completely, to be made small by anyone who needed her to be. She had not come to Blackthorn Ranch looking for a fight, and she had not come looking for a family, and she had not come looking for a reason to carry on with the particular, driven, unrelenting quality that was simply the shape of who she was. But she had found all 3, and she had learned, in the way that only certain kinds of hard living teach, that the things you do not go looking for, the things that find you in the middle of your most stripped down and purposeless seasons, are sometimes the things that fit most precisely into the exact shape of what you needed all along. Margaret would have found the right word for that. She always did. Eleanor thought she might spend the rest of her life looking for it, and that the looking itself, the careful and persistent and particular attention it required, was perhaps the whole point. She looked up at the stars, and she breathed in the October air, and she let the night be what it was, quiet and large and full of the future. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. End. The Widow Who Smelled Death.